Christof Koch, one of the most influential neuroscientists working on consciousness, takes on a question most of us quietly avoid. In his book, Then I Am Myself the World, he explores what it really means to die. In this video, his ideas will be our guide as we look over the edge of our own mortality. Koch begins from a truth almost everyone senses but few dare to face directly. Every one of us is going to die, sooner or later, no matter how carefully we eat, how much we exercise, how well we sleep, or how much we look after the body. There is no spiritual method, wellness routine, or technological breakthrough that cancels that ending. Death is not one possibility among many. It is the one certainty. From there, Christof Koch invites us to see consciousness as a stream. There was a first inner dawn, a moment when the world appeared within us. Colors and sounds, memories and fears, desires and attachments. That current of experience has been flowing ever since, often in the background. But like every river, it does not run forever. Just as every day has its night, the river of our experiences also reaches its final stretch. What troubles us is not only the death of the body, but the possibility of not existing at all. Koch explains that once the mind truly grasps the idea of absolute nothingness, that thought cannot simply be erased. It hides in the background, like a quiet shadow that follows us through life. It surfaces in moments of crisis or illness, or on those long nights of insomnia when there is nothing left between you and the void. Christof Koch himself went through this in a visceral way. In middle age, he woke one night with a physical certainty that one day his consciousness would go out forever. Not as a poetic image, but as a hard fact. He imagined an eternity without presence, a total silence with no one there to experience it. That inner vertigo haunted him for years and shaped his intellectual and spiritual search. Much later, after a profound experience in which every sense of body, external world, and ego dropped away, his relationship with death shifted. The certainty of his own ending remained, but it was no longer only a threat. It had become part of the mystery of consciousness itself. That is where our journey begins. On the edge of that mystery, looking straight at the limit of reality that awaits us all. Christof Koch argues that we live on borrowed time, and that this quiet knowledge shapes the whole of our minds. We all know, somewhere in the background, that the story of I comes to an end, and to avoid breaking under that weight, the psyche defends itself. Koch describes how we push out of sight whatever disturbs us. State-sanctioned violence, the fragility of the body, the simple fact that nobody gets out of life alive. Looking away is not just indifference, it is a form of self-protection. On a collective level, he says, organized religion acts as an even stronger defense. Christianity promises an eternal heaven where the person continues forever. Buddhism speaks of cycles of rebirth that stretch beyond this single life. The message is similar in both cases. Death is not a final cut, but a step inside a much longer story. That can be deeply comforting, yet it also spares us from fully facing the possibility of sheer nothingness. Koch then adds a modern version of this promise, digital immortality. The idea of uploading the mind to the cloud, preserving memories, personality traits, and choices as data, is presented as a new way to keep existing when the body dies. It is a technological dream that swaps temples for servers, but it answers the same ancient fear. Against all these strategies, Christof Koch introduces an uncomfortable contrast. There is no evidence that apes, dogs, crows, or bees torment themselves with the thought of their own death. They live in an ongoing present. Human beings, by contrast, carry past and future inside the mind. once the thought of total annihilation of the self really appears, it cannot be erased. It stays there like a fixed shadow. For that reason, Koch recalls an old spiritual teaching. Meditating each day on one's own death takes some of the poison out of fear. He draws on the reflection of journalist Andrew Sullivan, who writes about the need to make peace with the great silence at the end. To show how differently we respond to that destiny, Christof Koch turns to literature. He mentions a story by Ray Bradbury in which a couple calmly accepts the last night of the world, putting their children to bed and lying down together in peace. In sharp contrast stands the poet Dylan Thomas, calling for us to resist with fury against the dying of the light. Between that quiet acceptance and that fierce refusal lies the range in which we try to live alongside death while we are still alive. Christof Koch explains that for almost all of human history, death was identified in a very simple way. The heart stopped beating and the lungs stopped breathing. That was the classic cardiopulmonary death. Everything changed when pacemakers and mechanical ventilators appeared, machines able to keep a body going, even when the mind can never return. In the late 1960s, a committee at Harvard proposed a new definition. A person should be considered dead when they enter an irreversible coma, when all functions of the brain have been lost for good. On this basis, the Uniform Determination of Death Act was drafted in the United States. It set out two paths for declaring someone dead: either an irreversible stop of circulation and breathing, or an irreversible stop of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. To apply this criterion, Koch explains, the patient must be in a coma with a known cause, show no brainstem reflexes, and have no ability to start breathing on their own. On these requirements rests the so-called dead donor rule. Doctors may only remove vital organs such as the heart, liver, lungs, and kidneys once the person is, in legal terms, a corpse. This is where the unsettling figure of the beating heart cadaver appears. Bodies connected to a ventilator, with the chest rising and falling, that look alive to the family, but have already crossed, in the eyes of the law, the final line. Koch points out that in just a few decades, society has accepted this radical shift in the meaning of death, with far less conflict than other topics such as abortion. Yet the majority of people still die in the old cardiopulmonary way, often under sedation and strong painkillers that soften the mind in the last days of life. None of this is truly uniform. Christof Koch notes that the practical rules vary between hospitals and between states. The number of doctors required to certify death, the tests they must perform, and even how much weight religious objections are given. The result is that one person can be considered dead in one place and alive in another. To make things even more complex, the law speaks of the whole brain. Yet regions such as the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland may go on releasing hormones, sustaining growth, menstruation, blood pressure, and immune defense. The body can continue biologically alive without a mind. For Koch, this clinical paradox sets the stage for even more extreme dilemmas that he will confront next. Christof Koch explains that the legal idea of whole brain death does not always match what is really happening inside the body. On paper, the person is dead, yet deep in the brain, regions such as the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland can remain active, quietly releasing hormones. Because of this, an organism with no trace of consciousness can continue to grow, regulate blood pressure, menstruate, fight infections, and even sustain a pregnancy. In the medical literature, there are reports of dozens of women diagnosed with brain death who were kept on life support in order to carry a pregnancy. For weeks or months, their bodies without minds continued to nourish the fetus until the baby reached a viable age and was born. In the eyes of the law, the mother was a corpse. Biologically, her body still functioned as a complex system in the service of another life. Koch pushes this paradox to its limit with the story of Jahi McMath. Jahi was a teenager in California who suffered serious complications after surgery. Doctors diagnosed her as brain dead, and under the law of that state, she had already died. Her family, however, refused to accept that verdict. They fought to have her transferred to New Jersey, one of the few places in the United States where the legal framework allowed her to remain on a ventilator in long-term care. For almost 5 years, Jahi's body continued to change. She grew taller, went through puberty, and showed the ordinary signs of development. Eventually, she died from complications linked to liver failure. For Christof Koch, her case reveals a deeply unsettling truth. For years, her body was alive, with growth and hormones and immune responses, but there was no evidence of any surviving consciousness. The person Jahi once was had, as Koch puts it, crossed the great divide of being and was not coming back. From here, the neuroscientist draws a clear distinction. The end of consciousness does not necessarily coincide with the end of biological life. The law often treats them as if they were the same moment. Human experience does not. A body without a mind does not feel pain, does not fear, does not hope. The suffering falls instead on those around the bed. Parents, partners, children, held in a long limbo between fragile hope and the need for a final farewell. That is why, in his own advance directive, Christof Koch is explicit. He does not wish to be maintained in such a state. If his mind is irreversibly gone, he would rather that life support be withdrawn, his organs donated, and the mourning of the living allowed to begin. For him, keeping an organism going once it has been emptied of experience does not add meaning. It only postpones the moment when those who remain can accept his death, remember the person he was, and continue with their own lives. Christof Koch turns here to one of the most unsettling questions of all: what the brain does in its final minutes. When the heart stops beating, blood flow to the brain ceases, and the person loses consciousness within seconds. On an electroencephalogram, the electrical activity becomes smaller and slower until the dreaded flat line appears. At that point, there is no perception, no thought, no memory. Yet Koch explains that in some patients monitored in neurological intensive care units, the story is not always so simple. After blood pressure collapses, the brain does not just fade out gently. In a minority of cases, it shows a last burst of activity. For a short period of time, the electrical signals rise sharply, especially in the higher frequencies. These final surges have been seen only in a fraction of patients, and never in those already diagnosed as brain dead. In 2 cases that were studied in detail, doctors observed a marked increase in activity in the gamma band, focused in posterior regions of the cortex. Christof Koch notes that other research has linked both gamma rhythms and these posterior areas to conscious experience. That opens the door to a striking possibility. Just before the final blackout, the brain may briefly enter a state of intense, organized activity, perhaps even brushing once more against the edge of awareness. More cautious voices in medicine offer a very different reading. They argue that this rise in activity might reflect localized epileptic discharges, or even tiny muscle contractions contaminating the signal. creating a pattern that merely looks like the signature of consciousness without there being anyone left to experience it. As oxygen levels fall and carbon dioxide rises, the chemical environment becomes unstable and can drive neurons into a terminal overexcitation before they finally fail. Christof Koch does not insist on one single interpretation. He simply underlines that, at this threshold between life and death, the brain does not always go quietly. Sometimes it flares, as if responding to the collapse of the body with a last electrical storm. To capture the strangeness of this, Koch recalls an image from Hamlet, the character in William Shakespeare's play, who speaks of the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveller returns. Whatever is happening in those final surges of activity still belongs to that undiscovered territory. What unfolds in that brief interval between the collapse of the body and the silence of the brain remains, for now, beyond our reach. If it has any inner side at all, we will only learn it at the end of our own stream of consciousness. After exploring the electrical activity of the dying brain, Christof Koch pauses on a phenomenon that is as unsettling as it is moving: terminal lucidity. The term is used for those moments when someone who has been confused, disoriented, or almost unreachable suddenly regains a surprising clarity shortly before death. Families and carers tell strikingly similar stories. Patients who no longer recognized anyone open their eyes, call people by name, remember events from the past, and become calm and fully present. That clarity can last a few minutes, a few hours, or in some cases a day or two. After that brief flowering of consciousness, death follows. Christof Koch mentions that this phenomenon might be linked to the final electrical surges seen in some dying brains, but he is clear that science does not yet know how to account for it. There is no established model that connects those spikes of activity with this sudden, temporary awakening of the mind. Koch illustrates terminal lucidity with a deeply personal experience. He describes visiting an ex-girlfriend who was in hospital with advanced stomach cancer. For days, she was barely conscious, drifting in and out, hardly responsive. Then, on the last night of her life, something changed. She regained a striking clarity. They talked for a long time, sharing memories and emotions with complete lucidity. Soon after that night of unexpected presence, she died. For Koch, that final conversation was a gift that permanently shaped how he understands death. In earlier times, physicians knew this pattern well. They described it as a phase of clarity of mind at the very end of the dying process. It was part of the clinical picture of how people leave this world. Modern medicine, by contrast, hardly mentions it. One likely reason, Koch suggests, is the widespread use of sedatives and strong painkillers at the end of life. These drugs can reduce the chance that terminal lucidity appears or hide it behind a pharmacological fog. Christof Koch sees terminal lucidity as a double gift. For the person who is dying, it offers a last stretch of full consciousness. For those who remain, it offers a final chance to be recognized, to say what needs to be said, and to find a measure of meaning and peace in the middle of the end. By the end of his reflection, Christof Koch is no longer speaking only as a neuroscientist, but as a human being who knows that he too is going to die. After walking us through cases of brain death, bodies kept going by machines, and moments of terminal lucidity, he reaches a conclusion that is both hard and calm at the same time. When the mind goes out for good, the person who lived in that body has crossed a line from which there is no return. Koch describes that line as a great divide of being. On one side lies existence with consciousness, thoughts and memories, love and fear, plans and disappointments, a whole inner story. On the other side, there is only biological life, a body that breathes, a heart that beats, glands that secrete hormones, but with no one inside who can honestly say, I. From the point of view of both science and spirituality, there is no longer a subject there, only an organism. This is why he asks, very bluntly, what is gained by keeping a body without consciousness going for weeks, months, or even years? For that being, there is no longer suffering or hope. Nothing can be added or taken away. The weight falls instead on the living. Families stuck in a grief that never quite begins and never quite ends, facing impossible decisions, guilt, exhaustion, and a heavy economic and social burden. The one being kept going is not the person in the bed, but those still standing around it. Faced with this reality, Christof Koch does not stay in the realm of theory. In his advanced directive, he writes that if his mind is irreversibly lost, he does not want to be maintained by machines. He would rather have life support withdrawn, his organs donated, and his loved ones free to mourn, say goodbye, and move on with their own lives. For him, to honor consciousness is also to know when to let go of the body once consciousness is gone. That, he says, is the true art of letting go. And that concludes our video. If you enjoyed the content as much as we did, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your feedback and suggestions for future videos. And don't forget to turn on notifications to stay up to date with all our updates. Thanks for being part of our community. See you in the next video.